Hi everyone, welcome to my channel Bibbidi Bobbidi Books. My name is Ellie and today I am so excited to be filming my August and September reading wrap up. So I did pretty terribly with the TBR that I set out for myself in September. I think I only read one book that I was supposed to read that month, but in my defense I went on holiday in September and I wanted to mood read a little bit whilst I was out there, and I was also quite poorly towards the end of the month as well, so I didn't read as much as I would have liked to, and the books that I did read I was just picking up because I fancied reading them rather than sticking to my TBR. That being said, I do have a lot of books to talk through today, so I have a feeling this is probably going to be quite a long video, so you might want to grab yourself a nice hot cup of tea or a snack or something because we're going to be here for a little while. I will also leave a list of all the books that I read down below with timestamps, so if you want to skip ahead to hear my thoughts on anything in particular, please feel free to go ahead and do that. But without further ado, I am just going to jump straight in with the first book. So the first book that I picked up is Snow Glass Apples by Neil Gaiman and Colleen Doran. So this is a dark adult retelling of Snow White in graphic novel format. So it basically takes a classic fairy tale and makes it horror, which I really enjoyed. Interestingly, this is all told from the perspective of the stepmother, who is the villain in the classic story, and it's basically her telling us what really happened. So there's no dialogue between different characters in here, it's all told from the stepmother's point of view. She's basically telling us a story and telling us the narrative, and I just thought that was quite an interesting take on this story. It is quite short, so it's a very quick read, but the standout for me is absolutely the artwork. I will try and show you a little bit of the artwork from inside because honestly it is so beautiful. It's incredibly gothic, it's incredibly atmospheric, it's completely perfect for this type of story, and it almost reminded me a little bit of stained glass windows, and it just felt very gothic and atmospheric. So I loved the artwork in here, and I also really enjoyed how there's a section at the back that's written by the illustrator, and it's talking through the creative process that was involved behind creating this graphic novel. So it talks about their inspiration behind the pieces of artwork. It also shows us some of the concept art and some of the early images, and I almost enjoyed reading that section more than the actual story itself. So yeah, I'm really glad that they included that, but I would highly recommend this to you if you're a fan of this style of artwork and if you're looking for something creepy and eerie to pick up this Halloween. Next up I have another graphic novel. So this one is The Me You Love in the Dark, and it's written by Skottie and George Corona. So this is an adult horror graphic novel, and this has a haunted house type setting. So basically this story follows our main character, who is an artist, and she has lost inspiration for her artwork. So she feels like she's churning out the same stuff and she doesn't really feel like she's connected to her art pieces anymore. So she's very much looking for inspiration, and she decides to move into this house, this creepy old house that has been rumoured to be haunted, because she's hoping that being in that kind of situation and that atmosphere might inspire her to create pieces that are a little bit more edgy, that are a little bit more different, and pieces of art that speak more to her. So yeah, we follow her as she moves into this creepy house, and she spends the first year in this house, and we see how that kind of changes her as a person and how that affects her artwork. As I'm sure you can imagine, we quickly find out that she isn't perhaps alone in this house, and it gets pretty dark. I will say check out the content warnings for this one because there are quite a lot of difficult and heavy topics that are discussed, including abuse and possessiveness, and of course there is a lot of kind of gory, graphic things in here, quite a lot of violence, as you might expect from a horror novel. So just be warned of that before you go in. But I thought it was a really interesting look at how relying on one person as your sole source of inspiration might not necessarily be a good thing. So yeah, I really enjoyed this one, and I will probably be carrying on with this series, and I would recommend this to you if you're looking for something creepy to pick up this Halloween. Okay, so the next book that I picked up was one that I read on my Kindle, and this is Kill River by Cameron Roubique. So this is a slasher book that's based in the 80s in an abandoned water park, which is such a fun setting for a slasher book. I'm not sure if this book is adult or young adult because the characters in it are quite young, but there are a lot of very gory, graphic scenes as you would expect from a slasher book, so I'm not sure what audience this one is targeted at. But in this story we follow our main character, who is a 13-year-old girl, and she gets sent off to this summer camp by her parents very much against her will. She doesn't want to go, but she ends up making friends with this rebellious group of teenagers, and they all decide to break out one night. So they decide to escape the summer camp, and they go off into the woods and stumble across this abandoned water park. And at first it seems like it's a really fun place to be because they get to go on all the rides without having to queue or anything, but there is a very unsettling feeling about the place and the fact that no one's there, and it just seems really creepy. And then things take a very dark turn when one of them ends up going missing, and the story progresses from there. So I really enjoyed this one. To me, this one felt like reading a book version of a classic 80s horror movie, because it had all of those tropes and things that you expect to see in those movies in the book. So that made it feel very nostalgic to me. I loved the 80s setting. The only thing I would say is that it was a little bit slow to get going. So the first half of the book is pretty slow. It takes quite a long time before we even get to the water park. But once you cross the halfway mark of the book, things do really escalate quite quickly and become very intense, and you kind of can't put the book down. So I would say you need to kind of just get through that first half of the book, and it does really pick up after that. My only other little gripe with this book is that I wish the characters were aged up a little bit, just because some of the scenes that were written in this book just felt a little bit uncomfortable given the age of the characters. So as I was reading it, I was just imagining that they were a little bit older, maybe sort of 16, 17, 18 rather than 13. But all in all, I had a really fun time with this one, and I would recommend this one to you if you're a fan of slasher movies. Perhaps if you're new to slasher books, I think this might be quite a fun one to start with. And yeah, I had a really fun time with it. Okay, so next up we have my buddy read for August, and that was Nettle and Bone, written by T.Kingfisher. So I read this with the lovely Skim with Steph and with Reading Nymph, and we all really enjoyed this book. This is a really fun fairy tale-like story, and we follow our main character Mira, who is a 30-year-old convent-raised princess, and she is trying to save her sister from an abusive prince. So Mira, concerned for her sister's safety, ends up plotting to get rid of this prince, and she gets help from a rather unlikely group of characters. So we have a grave witch, we have a reluctant fairy godmother, we have a strapping former knight, and a chicken possessed by a demon. And they all come together to kind of try and get rid of this prince character, and it turns into quite a fun story. I will say that the beginning has quite a lot of dark topics and potentially triggering content in there, so just be warned of that before you go in, because the author is really trying to make us get on board with Mira's motive. So I can understand why they did that, but just be warned of that. But once you get past those difficult chapters, it turns into quite a light-hearted story. There's quite a lot of comedy thrown in there, and there's also some really amazing atmospheric descriptions. Parts of this book really felt like a fever dream to me, and I just loved how creative it was. And yeah, it had a really fun found family trope in there as well. So I would recommend this to you if you're looking for a fairly quick standalone fantasy, and if you're wanting something that's going to be atmospheric and perfect for this time of year. Next up we have A Pinch of Magic by Michelle Harrison. So this is the first book in a middle grade fantasy adventure series, and in this book we follow three sisters who are trying to break this curse that was put on their family. And I really enjoyed this story. I thought it was really atmospheric and perfect for this time of year because it actually opens on Halloween, and they also live on this island called Crowstone, and it's a really sort of dank place. It's really misty and marshy and atmospheric, and it's just a very very kind of spooky setting, which I just loved. And I also really loved all of the sisters in here, so the characters were fantastic. I really felt like we got to know each of the sisters, and they all felt very distinct and had such great little personalities, and I also enjoyed the dynamic between the three of them. And I just loved the focus on sisterhood in here and the fact that they would do anything to help each other out. I also love the fact that they live in this pub which is known as the Poacher's Pocket, which is just so cute, and they live there with their grandmother. And I also loved the pinch of magic in this book. See what I did there? No, I loved the fact that we had some magical elements in here as well. So each of the sisters actually inherits a magical heirloom which they use on their adventure. And yeah, I just love this one. I think this is perfect to pick up for this time of year. So if you're looking for a middle grade, highly recommend A Pinch of Magic. Okay, so next up we have a science fiction novella called A Psalm for the Wild Built, and this was written by Becky Chambers. So this I definitely think is my favourite book that I read over the last couple of months. I absolutely loved it. I'm convinced that I will adore anything that Becky Chambers writes, because every single book of hers that I have read has ended up being a favourite. So I highly recommend for you to go and check out this author if you haven't already, and if you're a fan of science fiction. But yes, this is such a lovely short story. So in this book we follow a monk who lives in a city, and they decide to leave the city because they're wanting a change. They're kind of seeking fulfillment, and they're just wanting to try something new. So they decide to leave and they become a travelling monk. So they live in this little wagon and they travel sort of from village to village across the countryside, and at each village they set up a little sort of tea station. So they set out some tables and some chairs, and they create a safe place for people to come and chat to the monk if they've got anything on their mind, if there's anything that they're worried about. They can go ahead and they can just have some support from the monk. So the monk will just listen to them, will provide emotional support, and they will also brew them a special cup of tea, which is just so cute. It's such a wholesome idea, and I just really enjoyed following along with our monk on their travels and exploring the world, because it's such an interesting world as well, because their humans very much live at one with nature. So there's lots of gorgeous descriptions of the countryside and the forests and things. And on their travels the monk actually runs into a robot. So in this world, machines have become sentient, and the robots have kind of separated themselves from humanity, so they both live separately. And this is the first time a human and a robot have met and interacted with each other for many years, and it's just really lovely seeing the two of them getting to know each other, and they form this really lovely friendship. And I just loved spending time with the two of them and hearing their conversations about what it means to exist and what it means to be conscious and what it means to be a person. And it's just so lovely. It's a very quiet story, so it's definitely not going to be for everybody, but I personally really enjoyed it. I thought it was really cozy and comforting, and would highly recommend it if you think that sounds interesting. Okay, so next up we have House of Salt and Sorrows, written by Erin A. Craig. So this is a young adult fantasy horror story, and it's also a retelling of the 12 Dancing Princesses fairy tale. And in this story we follow our main character Annalie, who is a princess who lives on this island, and 4 of her older sisters have actually died of various different reasons, along with her mother. And because there's been so much tragedy in her family, the people who live on the island are starting to think that the royal family must be cursed. And Annalie doesn't actually believe that her family is cursed, but she has to admit that there's something suspicious about the most recent death in the family, and so she decides to kind of investigate, and she's very much trying to find out what happened to her sister and what is going on in their family. And we follow her as she uncovers some interesting things. I don't want to say too much more than that. Also, we have a family who have been in mourning for such a long time, and we've got all of these sisters who, you know, have grown up always, you know, being in mourning and having to wear black and things like that, and so they're very tired of that. And a lot of the sisters have decided to put that aside and to get on with their lives, and they decide to sneak out at night to attend these glittering secret balls. And Annalie isn't as interested. She's not ready to sort of move on from her grief, I suppose, and we see how that plays out. Again, I don't want to give anything away, but I adored the setting of this one. I thought it was really interesting finding out about the culture of the people who live on this island, because they all worship the sea god and they believe that they're made from the salt of the sea. And I just loved the descriptions in here as well. There were some scenes that were really quite scary and definitely stuck with me. The horror elements are definitely there, so be warned of that, and do look up the trigger warnings and things. But I also enjoyed the scenes that were equally beautiful and eerie at the same time. I just loved that juxtaposition, and yeah, I just thought this was incredibly atmospheric and would highly recommend this one if you're looking for something creepy to pick up this time of year. Okay, so next up we have Fable by Adrienne Young. So this is the first book in a young adult fantasy series, and in this story we follow our main character Fable, who is the daughter of a captain who abandons her on an island because he doesn't think that she's set out for life on the seas. So Fable has to try and survive on this island, and it's a pretty dangerous place to be. There's some pretty dangerous characters who also live on this island, and she has to keep her wits about her, and she has to be pretty crafty and resourceful. And the way that Fable earns coin is by deep diving. So she'll dive down into the ocean and she will find these gems, these precious gems that are in the coral and in the rocks at the bottom of the oceans, and she trades those for coin, and she basically saves up enough coin to pay for passage to get off the island. So she goes onto this pirate ship, she sails away from the island, and she is basically trying to hunt down her father to claim back what is rightfully hers. Now, I read this book on holiday and I think it was the perfect book to read in that setting, because there's lots of gorgeous descriptions of the glittering sea and the sea spray, and it was very atmospheric for a summer read. But I didn't love this story as much as I wanted to. It didn't have as much action or swashbuckling as I was expecting from a piratey type story. I would say that nothing major really happened. It felt like everything was all on one level really. There was no kind of escalation at all. It almost felt like the entire of this first book was just a setup for the rest of the series, so I think that was a little bit of a shame. I did really enjoy our main character though. I thought that she was incredibly resourceful, she was incredibly resilient and determined, but the side characters for me weren't that memorable, and there was a romance plotline in here that I didn't feel particularly invested in. I didn't think it was particularly believable. It felt very much like the author was just telling us that the characters were attracted to each other rather than showing us. So I just wish that there was more page time dedicated to us seeing them kind of form an attraction to each other and forming that romance, and for me then it would have been a little bit more believable. So yeah, I didn't love this one. It was a fun read to pick up during the summer, but I don't think that I will be carrying on with this series, unfortunately. Okay, so sorry if the camera angle has changed slightly. I just had to go and replace the battery because I've been talking for too long. So yeah, apologies if it's shifted slightly. But next up we have a novella called The Deep, written by Rivers, Solomon and colleagues. So this is a really interesting fantasy novella that explores generational trauma. So the premise behind this story is that there are a group of mer people, a community of mer people who live in the ocean, and they are actually descended from slaves who were tossed overboard during passage across the seas. So basically the idea is that there were these African slave women who were pregnant and were considered to be a drain on resources, and so they were just tossed overboard to be drowned, and their children were actually born in the sea, and they actually adapted to become these merfolk. So you kind of have to suspend your disbelief a little bit with this one, but I think it's such an interesting idea, and this book focuses very much on trauma. So the idea is that the history of these people is incredibly traumatic and is very, very painful, and so what they do is they actually appoint this person known as the historian, and it's their job to hold on to all of these memories and to hold on to the history of their people because it's too painful for everybody else to kind of cope with. And then once a year the historian will impart their knowledge onto the community, so they will share their memories so they can all recall their shared history story for a couple of days a year, and then they pass it back to the historian so that they can go on with their lives. So the idea is that they will always have this itch of wanting to know where they came from, which is why they have this event once a year where the historian tells them where they came from. But once they find out where they came from, they realise that it's incredibly painful, and they want to give those memories back so that they could go back to living their normal life. And in this story we follow the perspective of the historian, and we see how taxing it is to have that job and how difficult it is. And the book definitely discusses a lot of themes on morality and on healing, and on obviously generational trauma, and on community, and it's just a really interesting one. It's definitely one that I will think about for a while, and it's one that I probably will reread a couple of times to kind of get my head around everything, because I feel like there's quite a lot to unpack in there. But yeah, I would recommend this one. I thought it was a really interesting concept. It was incredibly unique. It wasn't like anything that I'd read before, but do be warned that it is quite heavy, because of course we are talking about some really difficult subjects in this story, so be warned of that before you go in. But if you think it sounds interesting, I would definitely recommend checking it out. Okay, so next up we have another novella. So this one is Empress of Salt and Fortune, written by Nghi. So this is a Asian inspired fantasy novella, and it's all about the importance of storytelling. I love this one. It's very whimsical in the way that it's written, and in this story we follow our main character, who is a cleric, and they are trying to gather information about the Empress who has recently passed away. So they're trying to recover information about her life and everything, so they can just keep a record, I suppose, of the Empress and remember things about her. And on the cleric's travels they end up bumping into an old woman who turns out to be the Empress's old handmaiden, and the story is basically about the handmaiden telling the cleric stories about the Empress's life. That's pretty much all this book focuses on, and I really enjoyed it. I think that it was a lovely dynamic between the two characters. I also really enjoyed the themes of female relationships in this story, because there was a focus on different types of female relationships, be that romantic, be that platonic, and I feel like that's something that isn't often discussed in the story. So I really enjoyed that theme in this story, and as I said before, the theme of storytelling and the importance of holding on to stories and sharing stories with each other. And yeah, I really enjoyed this one, so definitely check it out if you're looking for something whimsical. Okay, and the final book that I have to talk to you about is actually the only book that was actually on my September TBR, and that is Into the Drowning Deep by Mira Grant. So this is an adult horror suspense story, and the setup is that there was this ship called the Antarctic that went out to explore this unknown area of ocean, and it was filled with a crew of people who were trying to film this mockumentary about whether mermaids exist. And the ship actually was found several days later with none of the crew on board. So all of the crew were missing, and some footage from the voyage was actually leaked, and it seemed to show that the crew was actually attacked by these mermaid-like sea creatures. And that footage was actually quickly hidden away from public eyes, and everyone dismissed it as just a hoax. No one believes that the footage is actually real. And then fast forward to present day, and we're following the sister of someone who was on board the Antarctic, and she has always held on to the belief that that footage was actually real, and she thinks that the crew was attacked by these sea creatures. And so she's dedicated her life to studying marine biology, and she's doing her PhD on that specific area of water, and she's trying to prove the existence of these creatures. And the story takes off when she's actually approached by the company that were involved with the first voyage out to that area of ocean, and they're trying to organise another ship to go out and explore that same area of ocean to try and get to the bottom of what happened to the first ship. And so they're building this crew of really skilled scientists to go out and to explore the area properly, and she is chosen as one of the people to go on board this voyage. And we followed her journey from there. So yeah, I really enjoyed this one. It was quite different to what I was expecting actually. There is a heavy focus on science in this book, so there's a lot of discussion about different types of marine biology. So our main character, she's doing her PhD on kind of like sound waves in the ocean, and yeah, it was just really fascinating because it made it feel very real, and it also made it read much more like a science fiction, I would say, than a sort of like monster horror, if that makes sense. So you really felt like you were getting to know the science behind these sort of sea creatures and things, and it was just really fascinating. I also loved the characters in here. They were so well realized. They were all very complex and felt very real, and you really felt like you got to know all of the crew on board this ship. You had some really interesting dynamics on there. You had our main character, her ex-boyfriend was also on the ship. You had a married couple who had separated. You had twin sisters who were deaf and their older sister who was their interpreter, and I thought it was really interesting seeing their dynamic between each other and also between the rest of the crew. You also had a couple of people on there who were there as kind of security, so they're actually famous hunters, and they were just there because they thought it would be exciting to have the opportunity to potentially kill some sea creatures. And it was just a really interesting group of people, and it was really fascinating seeing their dynamic and seeing how that shifts as tensions rise, and this was very suspenseful. And of course we got all those horror elements in there as well. There were some gruesome graphic scenes in there, so do be warned of that before you go in, but it felt very like a slow build up of tension, and you were just kind of waiting for the action to happen. So yeah, my only complaint would be that I wish the action happened a little bit earlier, because I did find the middle section a little bit slow, but all in all I thought this was really, really well done and a really interesting take on the kind of monster horror genre. So yeah, I would recommend. Okay, so that brings me to the end of this video. I really hope that you've enjoyed it. I'm aware it's been quite a long one, so thanks for sticking with me. Please let me know if you've read any of these books before, because I'd love to have a little chat with you in the comments down below, or just leave me a little comment to let me know that you're here. Maybe leave me a pumpkin emoji if you're not sure what to write, and that way I know that I'm not just speaking into the void and there are actually people listening to me rambling on about books. Also, like this video if you liked it, because it helps out my channel, and consider subscribing if you haven't already, because we're so close to 600 subscribers now, which just blows my mind. I'm just so chuffed with how far this little channel has gone over the last year and a half, so thank you so much for your support. Anyway, I'm gonna head off now and leave you to enjoy the rest of your day, but thank you so much for tuning in, and I guess I'll see you next time with another video. Bye!